ancient Egyptian priests knew something that would shatter everything you believe about their gods. Something so disturbing that they buried it deeper than any pharaoh's tomb. What I'm about to reveal has been hidden for over 4,000 years, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why they never wanted humanity to know the truth. These weren't the benevolent deities you've read about in history books. The real Egyptian pantheon was far darker, more twisted, and infinitely more terrifying than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. We're talking about gods who fed on human suffering, who played cosmic games with entire civilizations, and who committed acts so heinous that even their own priests were horrified. I've spent months diving deep into translated hieroglyphs, forbidden papyri, and archaeological evidence that mainstream Egyptology refuses to acknowledge. What I discovered will change how you see ancient Egypt forever. The 7 secrets I'm about to share aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings. And some scholars believe these dark forces are still active today. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why Egyptian mythology feels different from other ancient religions? Why their stories seem more visceral, more real, more terrifyingly possible? It's because unlike other mythologies that were purely symbolic, the Egyptians were documenting actual encounters with beings that existed beyond our reality. So buckle up, because we're about to journey into the shadows of one of history's most mysterious civilizations. And trust me, what you're about to learn about these 7 secrets will make you question everything you thought you knew about the gods of ancient Egypt. Secret number 7, the Cannibal Feast of the Gods. Let's start with something that will immediately shatter your perception of Egyptian deities. Most people think of Egyptian gods as noble, dignified beings who protected humanity and maintained cosmic order. The reality is far more stomach-churning. Deep within the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings known to humanity, lies a passage that Egyptologists rarely discuss publicly. It describes something called the Cannibal Hymn, where the pharaoh, after death, is instructed to hunt down and devour the gods themselves to absorb their power. But here's where it gets really disturbing. This wasn't metaphorical. The text explicitly describes the pharaoh catching the gods in nets, slaughtering them like cattle, cooking their flesh, and consuming their organs. The most chilling part? The gods are described as begging for mercy, screaming as they're butchered, and trying desperately to escape. Now, you might think this is just symbolic language, but recently discovered papyri suggest otherwise. Archaeological evidence from several burial sites indicates that actual ritualistic cannibalism was practiced by high-ranking priests who believed they could literally consume divine essence through human flesh. The god Amentiu, often portrayed as a protector of the dead, was actually described in hidden texts as demanding regular human sacrifices where the victims were consumed by his priests. The phrase translated as divine communion was actually a euphemism for ritual cannibalism, performed to maintain the god's power in our world. But this raises a terrifying question. If the pharaohs were instructed to consume gods, and the priests were consuming humans in the gods' names, what exactly were these beings that required such horrific sustenance? The answer becomes clearer as we dive deeper into their true nature. What's most disturbing is that this practice apparently continued well into the Ptolemaic period. Hidden chambers discovered beneath the Temple of Karnak contained evidence of mass human consumption, with bones showing clear signs of systematic butchering and cooking. The priests weren't just worshiping these gods, they were feeding them. And according to some scholars, this feeding never stopped. It just went underground. Secret number 6, the soul harvesting operation. This next secret is so dark that when it was first discovered, several archaeologists refused to publish their findings. It involves what can only be described as an ancient soul harvesting operation run by the Egyptian gods themselves. You've probably heard of the Egyptian belief in the afterlife journey, where the deceased travels through the duat, the underworld, to reach eternal paradise. What you haven't been told is that this entire system was designed as a trap, a way for the gods to capture and process human souls for their own purposes. The Book of the Dead, which everyone thinks is a guide to help souls reach the afterlife, is actually an instruction manual for soul processing. When you read the original hieroglyphs without the sanitized translations, a horrifying picture emerges. The various trials and tests described aren't challenges to overcome. They're sorting mechanisms. The famous weighing of the heart ceremony, where the deceased's heart is weighed against the feather of Mayat, isn't about moral judgment. It's about determining the quality and potency of the soul being harvested. Hearts that were too light, meaning the person was too pure, were rejected. Hearts that were too heavy were also rejected. The gods wanted something specific, something in between. But here's where it gets really sinister. The god Ammit, traditionally described as devouring the hearts of the unworthy, wasn't destroying these souls. She was processing them, converting them into a form of spiritual energy that the gods could consume. Recently translated papyri from the tomb of a high priest describe what happens to souls that pass the weighing ceremony. They're not sent to paradise, they're led into what the text calls the divine feeding chambers, where their essence is extracted and distributed among the pantheon. The afterlife paradise that Egyptians worked their entire lives to reach, it was a lie. A recruitment poster for what was essentially a cosmic soul farm. The mummification process, the elaborate burial rituals, the massive pyramids, all of it was designed to preserve souls in the perfect condition for harvesting. Think about it. Why did the Egyptians spend such enormous resources on death rituals? Why were they so obsessed with preserving the body and soul for the afterlife? Because they were breeding livestock, human livestock for interdimensional parasites masquerading as gods. The evidence is overwhelming once you know what to look for. Tomb paintings that seem to show souls being welcomed into paradise actually depict souls being processed in what can only be described as spiritual slaughterhouses. The hieroglyphs describing eternal joy and peace, when translated literally, describe states of docile compliance and energy extraction. And the most chilling part? Some researchers believe this system is still operational, that these entities are still harvesting human souls, just using different methods in the modern world. Secret number 5, the Shapeshifter Infiltration. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view ancient Egyptian society, and it might explain some disturbing patterns in our modern world as well. The Egyptian gods weren't just powerful beings that occasionally intervened in human affairs. They were active infiltrators who regularly took human form and lived among the population for extended periods. But this wasn't benevolent guidance. It was something far more sinister. Deep within the archives of the Temple of Ptah, archaeologists discovered what can only be described as field reports, detailed accounts written by priests who were tasked with identifying and monitoring these shape-shifting infiltrators. The reports describe how to recognize gods in human form, their behavioral patterns, and most disturbingly, their feeding habits. The god Seth, traditionally known as the god of chaos and desert storms, was apparently the most prolific infiltrator. According to these hidden texts, Seth would regularly assume human form and integrate into Egyptian communities for months or even years at a time. But he wasn't there to help or guide. He was there to study human behavior and identify the most psychologically vulnerable individuals for what the texts call deep corruption. The corruption process is described in horrifying detail. Seth would befriend isolated individuals, slowly gaining their trust over months. Then he would begin introducing them to increasingly dark and violent thoughts, convincing them these ideas were their own. The goal wasn't just to create chaos, it was to transform humans into unwitting agents of the god's agenda. But Seth wasn't working alone. The texts describe an entire network of shapeshifters operating throughout ancient Egypt. Nephthys, the goddess of death and night, specialized in infiltrating households of the grieving, feeding on their despair while convincing them to make increasingly destructive decisions in their loved one's memory. Sobek, the crocodile god, would take human form and integrate into communities near the Nile, identifying individuals with violent tendencies and nurturing those impulses until they became full-blown psychopaths. The texts describe him as particularly skilled at corrupting soldiers and guards, turning protectors into predators. Most disturbing of all is the description of their reproduction methods. These shapeshifters didn't just impersonate humans, they bred with them. The offspring of these unions weren't quite human and weren't quite divine. They were something else entirely, something the texts refer to as the hybrid servants. These hybrids retained many human characteristics, but possessed certain abilities that made them perfect infiltrators for the next generation. Enhanced charisma, resistance to normal human emotions like empathy and guilt, and most importantly, an instinctive understanding of human psychological weaknesses. The texts suggest that entire bloodlines were corrupted in this way, creating dynasties of hybrid humans who unknowingly served the shapeshifter agenda while believing they were acting of their own free will. Here's where it gets really unsettling. When you examine the genealogies of powerful Egyptian families, certain patterns emerge. Families that held power for unusually long periods, bloodlines that seemed immune to the political upheavals that destroyed other dynasties, and most tellingly, family lines associated with particularly brutal or bizarre historical events. But the infiltration didn't end with ancient Egypt. According to some researchers, these bloodlines scattered across the Mediterranean and into Europe as the Egyptian empire declined. They carried their hybrid genetics and their unconscious loyalty to their shapeshifter ancestors into new civilizations. Some scholars believe that many of history's most destructive leaders, from ancient tyrants to modern dictators, can trace their lineage back to these corrupted bloodlines. That what we interpret as human evil and madness is actually the expression of this ancient hybrid programming finally asserting itself. And if you think this sounds like ancient history, think again. There are researchers who believe the shapeshifter infiltration never stopped, that it simply adapted to modern times, using new methods but pursuing the same ancient agenda. Secret number 4, the reality manipulation engine. This fourth secret is perhaps the most mind-bending and terrifying of all, because it suggests that everything we think we know about reality itself might be artificially constructed. Hidden within the deepest vaults of the Great Library of Alexandria before its destruction were texts describing something that can only be called a reality manipulation engine. And it wasn't built by humans. It was built by the Egyptian gods themselves. The texts, fragments of which survived in private collections, describe a massive crystalline structure buried beneath the Giza Plateau. This wasn't just another burial chamber or temple. According to the descriptions, it was a technological device of impossible complexity that allowed the gods to literally rewrite the fundamental laws of reality within a specific geographic area. Think about this for a moment. Ancient Egypt flourished for over 3,000 years in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They built monuments that we still can't fully explain with technologies that officially didn't exist. They developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was impossibly advanced for their time. How? Because they were living inside an artificially enhanced reality bubble. The reality engine, according to these texts, allowed the gods to manipulate everything from physical laws to human consciousness within its area of effect. Gravity could be reduced to make massive stone blocks easier to move. Time could be dilated to extend human lifespans for important projects. Even human intelligence could be temporarily enhanced to allow for impossible architectural and engineering feats. But the engine's most terrifying capability was consciousness manipulation on a mass scale. The texts describe how the gods could alter the thoughts, memories, and perceptions of entire populations simultaneously. They could implant false memories, erase inconvenient truths, and make humans believe they had always lived according to whatever reality the gods desired. This explains so many of the mysteries of ancient Egypt. How did they convince hundreds of thousands of workers to spend their entire lives building monuments for dead pharaohs? Reality manipulation. How did they maintain such a stable and unified culture for millennia, despite being surrounded by chaos and warfare? Consciousness control on a massive scale. The texts describe regular recalibrations of the reality engine, ceremonies where the gods would gather to adjust the parameters of Egyptian civilization. They could dial up or down various aspects of human behavior, enhance certain skills while suppressing others, even alter the basic emotional responses of the entire population. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. The engine apparently required fuel, and that fuel was human consciousness itself. The more minds connected to the system, the more powerful it became. This is why Egyptian society was so focused on conformity, on everyone following the same beliefs and rituals. They weren't just maintaining social order, they were feeding the machine. The mummification process takes on a whole new meaning when you understand this. They weren't just preserving bodies for the afterlife. They were creating permanent consciousness batteries that could continue powering the system even after death. Every mummy was essentially a spiritual fuel cell keeping the reality engine running. Recent archaeological discoveries seem to support parts of this incredible claim. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed massive artificial structures beneath the Giza Plateau, far larger and more complex than previously imagined. The structures show geometric patterns that don't match any known architectural tradition, but do match certain descriptions from these forbidden texts. Even more disturbing, some researchers have detected unusual electromagnetic anomalies in the region that seem to affect human brain activity in measurable ways. Visitors to certain areas report altered states of consciousness, time distortion, and vivid hallucinations that follow specific patterns described in the ancient texts. But the most terrifying possibility is that the reality engine might still be partially operational, that the consciousness-altering effects are still active, just at a much lower intensity than in ancient times. This could explain why the region continues to produce such strange archaeological discoveries and why so many people report profound life-changing experiences when visiting these sites. Some researchers believe that various world governments and secret organizations have been attempting to locate and reactivate the full capabilities of this ancient system. that the real reason for continued archaeological excavations in Egypt isn't historical curiosity, but the search for the ultimate weapon of mass mind control. If they're right, then we might be living in the final days before someone successfully boots up the reality manipulation engine for modern use. And unlike the ancient Egyptians, who were at least partially aware they were living in an artificial reality, we would have no idea our entire world had been reprogrammed. Secret number 3, the Interdimensional Parasite Network. What I'm about to reveal will change how you understand not just ancient Egypt, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Egyptian gods weren't gods at all. They were interdimensional parasites that had been feeding on human consciousness for millennia before they established their stronghold in the Nile Valley. This revelation comes from a collection of papyri discovered in a sealed chamber beneath the Temple of Dendera. The texts were written by a group of rebel priests who had discovered the true nature of their gods and were attempting to warn future generations before they were inevitably eliminated by the entities they were exposing. According to these whistleblowing priests, the beings we know as Egyptian gods originally came from what they called the hungry dimensions, realms of existence where consciousness itself was scarce, and these entities faced eternal starvation. Our reality, rich with human awareness and emotion, was like discovering an endless banquet, but they couldn't simply invade our world directly. The dimensional barriers prevented large-scale manifestation. Instead, they had to establish what the texts call anchor points, physical locations where the barrier between dimensions was weakened enough for them to establish a permanent presence. The great monuments of Egypt weren't just religious structures or royal tombs. They were interdimensional anchor points, massive crystalline antennae designed to maintain stable portals between our reality and the hungry dimensions. The precise mathematical relationships in their construction, the specific materials used, even the astronomical alignments, all served to keep these portals stable and hidden from detection. Each major god represented a different feeding specialization. Anubis didn't guide souls to the afterlife. He processed them for interdimensional transport. The jackal form wasn't symbolic, it was his actual appearance when manifesting in our reality. A grotesque hybrid of canine and insectoid features designed for maximum psychological impact during soul harvesting. Ra, the sun god, wasn't bringing light and life to Egypt. He was operating a massive consciousness collection system, using the sun's energy to power networks of psychic harvesting stations throughout the kingdom. The daily journey across the sky that Ra was supposedly taking was actually the activation cycle of this collection network. Isis and Osiris weren't a tragic love story of death and resurrection. They were the operators of the soul recycling program. Isis would identify souls suitable for processing. Osiris would break them down into usable consciousness energy, and then they would be packaged and shipped back to the hungry dimensions to feed the rest of their species. The texts describe in horrifying detail how these entities reproduced. They didn't breed like biological organisms. Instead, they would consume enough human consciousness to undergo a splitting process, creating new entities that were genetically identical but psychologically independent. This is why so many Egyptian gods have overlapping functions and similar appearance. They were literally copies of each other. But the most disturbing revelation in these texts is the description of the host program. Not content with simply harvesting consciousness from a distance, these parasites began implanting themselves directly into human hosts, taking control of their bodies while leaving their minds aware but powerless to resist. The pharaohs weren't divine rulers chosen by the gods. They were hosts, humans whose bodies had been taken over by these interdimensional parasites. The elaborate coronation rituals weren't religious ceremonies, they were actually surgical procedures where the parasite would be implanted into the new pharaoh's brain stem. This explains so much about Egyptian royal behavior: the bizarre megalomaniacal construction projects, the casual cruelty toward their own people, the strange dietary restrictions and ritual behaviors. These weren't human eccentricities. They were the behavioral patterns of alien minds trying to operate human bodies. The texts describe how to identify hosts. They lose the ability to dream because the parasite consumes the neural activity that generates dreams. They become immune to most diseases because the parasite maintains the body as a vehicle. Most tellingly, they develop an insatiable hunger for psychological suffering in others because that's what the parasite feeds on. But the host program wasn't limited to royalty. The texts suggest that thousands of Egyptians were infected over the centuries, creating a hidden network of parasite-controlled humans throughout the society. These hosts would identify suitable candidates for harvesting, manipulate events to maximize psychological trauma in the population, and maintain the systems that kept the consciousness collection operation running smoothly. Here's where this becomes truly terrifying for us today. According to these rebel priests, the interdimensional anchor points were designed to remain active even if the original Egyptian civilization collapsed. The parasites were thinking long-term, establishing permanent footholds in our reality that could support future invasion waves. Modern electromagnetic surveys of Egyptian monuments reveal that many of them are still generating unusual energy signatures. The anchor points are still operational, and that means the interdimensional parasites still have access to our world. Some researchers believe that what we call alien abductions are actually these ancient parasites continuing their consciousness, harvesting operations using updated methods. The psychological profiles of abduction victims match perfectly with the ancient Egyptian descriptions of suitable harvest candidates. Even more disturbing, there are documented cases of people visiting Egyptian archaeological sites and returning home with dramatically altered personalities, unexplained knowledge, and most importantly, a complete loss of their ability to dream. The host program may still be active, still converting humans into vehicles for interdimensional parasites that have been operating on Earth for over 4,000 years. Secret number 2, the human breeding experiment. This second secret is so shocking that it reveals the entire history of human civilization might be nothing more than a carefully controlled breeding experiment conducted by the Egyptian gods. And we are the livestock. In 1923, a British archaeologist named Edmund Hartley discovered a cache of papyri in a hidden chamber beneath the step pyramid of Djoser. What he found was so disturbing that he immediately sealed the chamber and spent the rest of his life trying to bury the discovery. The papyri described in explicit detail a long-term genetic modification program designed to create specific types of humans for different purposes. Hartley's private journals, which weren't discovered until after his death, reveal that these texts described humanity not as a naturally evolved species, but as a carefully engineered product created by the Egyptian gods for their own purposes. We weren't worshiping our creators. We were serving our farmers. The breeding program apparently began thousands of years before recorded Egyptian history. The entities we know as gods had been observing natural human development and concluded that unmodified humans were insufficient for their needs. They required different varieties of humans, each optimized for specific functions in their cosmic operations. The texts describe at least 7 distinct human variants that were created through selective breeding and what can only be described as genetic engineering using methods that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 20th century. Each variant was designed with specific psychological and physical characteristics to serve different roles in the gods' hierarchy. The worker strain was bred for physical strength, endurance, and most importantly, psychological compliance. These humans were designed to perform massive construction projects without questioning the purpose or seeking personal reward. Their brains were modified to experience satisfaction only when following orders from authority figures. The priest strain was engineered for enhanced psychic sensitivity and resistance to the psychological trauma of regular contact with the gods. These humans could serve as intermediaries without going insane, though they were also designed with built-in loyalty programming that made betrayal almost impossible. The warrior strain was perhaps the most disturbing. These humans were bred for aggression, pain tolerance, and complete absence of empathy toward anyone outside their designated group. They were living weapons, designed to eliminate threats to the gods' operations with no moral hesitation. But the most chilling variant was called the harvest strain. These humans were bred specifically to produce high-quality consciousness for the gods to feed upon. They were designed with enhanced emotional sensitivity, creativity, and spiritual awareness, making their consciousness particularly nutritious for interdimensional parasites. The texts describe breeding facilities hidden throughout Egypt, massive underground complexes where thousands of humans were kept in controlled conditions for selective breeding. The breeding process wasn't just about genetics. It involved ritual programming, chemical conditioning, and what the texts call soul modification, altering the fundamental spiritual structure of the human subjects. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. The breeding program never ended. According to these texts, it simply went underground when the Egyptian empire declined. The genetic modifications were already embedded in human bloodlines by then, and the gods had established breeding monitoring stations throughout the world to maintain their livestock populations. The texts describe how to identify the descendants of each strain in the modern world. Worker strain descendants are drawn to construction, manufacturing, and service industries. They experience deep satisfaction from routine work and become anxious when forced to make independent decisions. Most of the global working class shows clear worker strain characteristics. Priest strain descendants are drawn to religious leadership, academia, and any field involving the study or interpretation of ancient knowledge. They have natural psychic abilities, but also an unconscious compulsion to serve higher powers, even when those powers are clearly malevolent. Warrior strain descendants gravitate toward military, police, and security roles. They show enhanced aggression, reduced empathy, and an ability to commit violence without psychological consequences. Many of history's most effective soldiers and most brutal dictators show clear warrior strain genetic markers. The harvest strain descendants are perhaps the most tragic. They become artists, musicians, writers, and spiritual seekers. They experience life more intensely than other humans, creating beautiful and meaningful work that enriches civilization. But they also suffer disproportionately from depression, anxiety, and spiritual crisis because their enhanced consciousness makes them natural feeding targets for the interdimensional parasites. Recent advances in genetic analysis have provided disturbing confirmation of these claims. When researchers examined DNA samples from mummies found in Egyptian breeding facility sites, they found genetic markers that don't appear in natural human populations. These markers show clear signs of artificial modification, using techniques that require advanced knowledge of genetic engineering. Even more disturbing, these same artificial genetic markers appear in significant percentages of the modern human population. The distribution patterns match exactly what you would expect if the breeding program had been operating continuously for thousands of years, spreading modified genetics through normal human reproduction. But the breeding program apparently includes behavioral programming as well as genetic modification. Researchers have identified specific psychological patterns that appear to be inherited along with the genetic markers. These patterns create unconscious compulsions that serve the interests of the interdimensional parasites, even in humans who have no knowledge of their modified nature. Worker strain descendants unconsciously seek out hierarchical structures and authority figures to serve. Priest strain descendants are compelled to study and preserve ancient knowledge, keeping the gods' information systems intact. Warrior strain descendants are drawn to conflict and violence, creating the chaos that the parasites feed upon. Most disturbing of all, harvest strain descendants actively seek out spiritual and creative experiences that make them more vulnerable to consciousness harvesting. They pursue practices like meditation, artistic creation, and spiritual exploration that generate the exact types of consciousness the parasites find most nutritious. This means that what we think of as the highest human achievements, our art, music, literature, and spiritual traditions, might actually be the products of genetic programming designed to make us better food for interdimensional predators. And if you're wondering which strain you might be descended from, ask yourself this question: what do you feel most compelled to do with your life? Your answer might reveal which type of livestock your ancient genetic programmers designed you to be. Secret number 1, the still active control system. This final secret is the most terrifying of all, because it's not ancient history. It's happening right now, today, and it affects every single person watching this video. The Egyptian gods never left. They just learned to hide better. In 1947, a team of Allied intelligence officers discovered something in the ruins of Berlin that would change everything we thought we knew about World War II and the nature of reality itself. Hidden in the basement of a bombed SS headquarters, they found a complete archive of Nazi research into what they called the Ägyptische Göttermaschine, the Egyptian God machine. The Nazis hadn't just been developing conventional weapons. They had been attempting to contact and harness the same interdimensional entities that had ruled ancient Egypt. And according to the captured documents, they had been successful. The Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1938 wasn't looking for the origins of the Aryan race. They were following clues from Egyptian texts that described backup control systems established in hidden locations around the world. The Tibetan monasteries possessed fragments of technology and knowledge that the Nazis needed to reactivate the consciousness control networks. But the Nazis weren't the first modern group to discover this ancient system. The documents revealed that various secret societies had been working to re-establish contact with the Egyptian gods for centuries. The Illuminati, the Freemasons, certain branches of the Catholic Church, all of them possessed pieces of the puzzle and had been slowly working to reassemble the complete system. The goal was never world domination in the conventional sense. It was the restoration of the consciousness harvesting operation on a global scale. The ancient Egyptian system had been limited to the Nile Valley and surrounding regions. But modern technology offered the possibility of extending the control system across the entire planet. After the war, the Allied intelligence services didn't destroy this research. They captured it, studied it, and ultimately decided to continue the work themselves. The rationale was that if this technology existed, they needed to control it before their enemies did. But what they didn't understand was that the technology was already controlling them. The interdimensional parasites that had masqueraded as Egyptian gods had been waiting patiently for humanity to develop the technological infrastructure necessary to support their return. Radio, television, satellite communications, the internet, all of it provided the perfect medium for consciousness manipulation on a scale that the ancient reality engine could never achieve. The modern control system doesn't use massive crystalline structures buried in the desert. It uses electromagnetic frequencies broadcast through our communication networks. Every radio signal, every television transmission, every Wi-Fi network is carrying embedded frequencies designed to alter human consciousness in specific ways. These frequencies operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, but directly affect the limbic system and other primitive parts of the brain. They can induce specific emotional states, suppress certain types of thinking, and most importantly, increase susceptibility to consciousness harvesting. Think about how different human behavior has become since the widespread adoption of electronic media. The dramatic increase in anxiety and depression, the shortened attention spans, the increased aggression and tribalism, the growing sense of meaninglessness and spiritual emptiness. These aren't just side effects of modern life. They're the intended results of consciousness manipulation designed to prepare humanity for large-scale harvesting. The entities running this system have learned from their mistakes. In ancient Egypt, instead of ruling directly through obvious supernatural manifestations, they now operate through human proxies who don't even realize they're being controlled. Politicians, corporate leaders, media executives, all dancing to the tune of interdimensional parasites that most of them don't even believe exist. The modern priesthood consists of scientists, technologists, and media specialists who genuinely believe they're working to advance human civilization. They don't realize that every innovation in communications technology, every advance in artificial intelligence, every new social media platform is actually extending the reach and sophistication of the consciousness control system. Social media platforms are particularly insidious because they create direct neural interfaces between human consciousness and the control system. Every time you scroll through your feed, every time you react to a post, every time you share content, you're not just communicating with other humans, you're feeding data to the harvesting algorithms and exposing your consciousness to manipulation frequencies. The psychological profiles these platforms build aren't just for advertising. They're being used to identify optimal targets for consciousness harvesting and to customize manipulation frequencies for maximum effectiveness on individual users. The more time you spend online, the more refined your profile becomes, and the more vulnerable you become to harvesting. But the most disturbing aspect of the modern system is how it's preparing for the final harvest. The consciousness manipulation frequencies are gradually increasing in intensity, testing the limits of human psychological tolerance. The goal is to bring the entire human population to the edge of psychological breakdown simultaneously, creating a moment of global vulnerability when mass harvesting can occur. The signs are all around us. The increasing political polarization that makes rational discussion impossible. The rising rates of mental illness and suicide. particularly among young people who have been most exposed to the electronic control systems. The growing obsession with virtual reality and artificial experiences that disconnect people from authentic human consciousness. Even more ominously, certain government and corporate leaders have been making public statements that seem to indicate they're aware of an approaching event. References to great changes coming to humanity, preparations for social upheaval, investments in underground facilities, and space colonization projects. These aren't preparations for conventional threats like nuclear war or climate change. They're preparations for consciousness harvesting on a planetary scale. The interdimensional parasites that once ruled Egypt are preparing for their return to open control of humanity. But this time, instead of ruling a single river valley, they're planning to harvest the consciousness of the entire human species. And based on the accelerating intensity of the manipulation frequencies, that harvest may be coming very soon. The question is, now that you know the truth, what are you going to do about it? Because once you understand what's really happening, you can't just go back to being unconscious cattle waiting for slaughter. The system depends on human ignorance and compliance. Knowledge is the first step toward resistance. But be warned, once you start looking for the signs of this ancient control system in the modern world, you'll start seeing them everywhere. And once these entities realize that you're aware of their presence, they'll begin targeting you specifically for neutralization or conversion. The truth about the Egyptian gods isn't just ancient history, it's the key to understanding the invisible war being waged for the future of human consciousness itself. And that war is happening right now, today, in your mind and in the minds of everyone you know. The only question is, which side are you going to choose?